Echoes of the void, the prisoner who became the key. The air was heavy. Thick, like it hadn't been stirred in years. Shadows stretched long across the cracked pavement. Streetlights flickered, casting pale yellow glows. The smell of damp earth lingered in the air. Sarah's breath quickened. She stood at the edge of the alley, her shoes tapping nervously. The hairs on her neck stood tall, like a warning. A figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, broad, his movements slow. She didn't know what he wanted. But she could feel it. The danger. The coldness. Sarah, his voice was low, gravelly. She froze. Her name echoed in the quiet night. She never told him her name. How did he know? Her mind raced. Memories flashed in and out, like broken film. Who was he? His steps grew louder. Closer. His eyes never left hers. Do you remember me? He asked. His lips curled into a twisted grin. Sarah tried to back away, but her feet were stuck to the ground. It was like the earth had swallowed them whole. Her heart hammered in her chest. The alley seemed to close in on her. Darkness pressed in. The light felt distant now. Then, she heard it. The sound of chains rattling behind her. A metallic clink, sharp and urgent. Her pulse spiked. She turned quickly, but no one was there. The alley was empty, like before. Was it a trick? Her mind raced again. Suddenly, a hand gripped her wrist. Cold, hard. She gasped. His voice whispered in her ear, "You're mine now." The world spun. She could barely breathe. The figure pulled her into the dark. The alley swallowed them whole. She didn't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? But when the darkness lifted, she was no longer in the alley. She was in a room. Concrete walls. Bars on the window. Her hands were tied. Her legs too. Her mouth dry. Her body sore. Then she saw him again. The man who had taken her. He was standing in the corner, watching. But this time, he didn't smile. No grin. "Welcome home," he said, his voice cold. And then he turned. Walking away. The door clicked shut behind him. And she was alone again. Sarah's heart beat against her ribs, frantic, wild. The room was cold. Too cold. The silence pressed in on her. She pulled at her restraints, but they were tight, unyielding. The ropes scraped against her skin. Her fingers bled, but she didn't care. She had to get free. The walls felt like they were closing in. Her breath echoed, harsh and ragged. She glanced around the room. The only light came from a small, dim bulb in the ceiling. Flickering. It hummed, but there was no escape. Her mind spun, thinking. Why was she here? How long had he been planning this? She remembered the last few days. The phone call. The strange message. The man in the shadows. But none of it made sense. She strained to hear anything outside her cage. Footsteps. Voices. Nothing. The door clicked again. This time, it didn't open. Instead, a voice came from the other side. A low whisper, almost too quiet to hear. "Don't even try to escape." It was him. The man. The words were like ice, freezing her to the spot. "You're not the first," he continued. "But you'll be the last." She froze. Her skin prickled. Her throat tightened. What did he mean? Why was he doing this? Suddenly, the door creaked open. A sliver of light spilled into the room. Sarah gasped, straining against her bonds. But the figure in the doorway wasn't the man. It was someone else. A woman. Her face was pale, eyes hollow. Her hands trembled as she stepped inside. She didn't speak. She just stared at Sarah, as if she knew exactly who she was. Then, without a word, she reached into her coat pocket. A small, cold object, like a key. She unlocked the restraints, one by one. Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. When the ropes fell away, the woman gave her a single nod. Then she turned, disappearing back into the dark. The door closed softly. But Sarah didn't feel free. Something wasn't right. There had to be more. She stood, shaky, her legs weak beneath her. But as soon as she took a step, she heard the man's voice again. "Don't run," he warned. "You can't escape." Sarah's breath caught. She knew the truth now. She wasn't alone. And neither was he. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. The room felt smaller, darker, even though she had no idea how long she'd been in there. She could hear him now, his voice so close it was almost a whisper in her ear. "You're not the first to think you can escape." She spun, but there was no one. Just the shadows. The oppressive darkness pressing in around her. Her heart raced as she glanced toward the corner where the woman had stood. Gone. But the key was still on the floor, glinting under the dim light. She stepped toward it slowly. Her breath shallow. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. Her fingers brushed the cold metal. A shiver ran down her spine. She straightened up, key in hand. What now? The door. She had to get out. Her legs were unsteady as she approached it. But the sound of footsteps stopped her cold. Heavy. Slow. She turned, and there he was. The man. His silhouette framed by the doorway. His face was shadowed, but she could feel his eyes on her. His gaze was cold, calculating. "Going somewhere?" he asked. His voice dripped with amusement. Sarah gripped the key tighter. Her breath caught. "Let me go," she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. He smiled. A cruel, twisted smile. "Let you go?" He stepped forward. "You're already free." Sarah's eyes narrowed. What was he saying? "Free?" she asked, confused. He chuckled darkly. "Yes. Free." Before she could process it, he moved closer. Too close. His hand reached for her, gripping her wrist. His touch was ice. "You see, Sarah," he said, "this place, this room, it's not what you think. It's not a prison." She froze, staring at him. Her breath hitched in her chest. "It's a test." He pushed her toward the door. Her body collided with the frame. She gasped, trying to steady herself. "The real question is," he continued, his voice like a whisper now. "How far will you go to stay free?" She was speechless. Her mind was scrambling to understand. To make sense of it all. And then it hit her. This wasn't about getting out. It was about staying in. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of the game. His game. He released her wrist and stepped back. His smile never wavered. Sarah's hand trembled as she raised the key to the door. But before she could turn it, he whispered, "Choose wisely." The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. She stepped forward. But something held her back. A warning? Could she trust him? Or was the true escape deeper inside the nightmare? And then, she heard the woman's voice again, faint. "Don't go." But it was too late. Sarah stepped into the black void. And the door slammed shut behind her. The darkness swallowed her whole. No sound. No light. Just cold, heavy air pressing against her skin. Her feet moved, unsure. She could barely see her hands in front of her face. The key was still clutched in her fingers. Its cold metal a stark reminder of her choices. But it felt useless now. Every step she took echoed. Louder than before. As if the walls themselves were listening. Her pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of something watching her. Waiting. Sarah. The voice was soft, familiar. It sent a chill down her spine. It was him again. Did you think it would be easy? His words sliced through the darkness. She spun around. But there was no one. Just the endless black. The air seemed to shift. Grow heavier. Tighter. She took another step. But this time the ground beneath her shifted. The floor was no longer solid. She stumbled. Her foot catching on something. She fell. Hard. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud. The key slipped from her fingers and clattered across the floor. But she barely noticed. Her hands were trembling. Her breath shallow and quick. When she looked up, the blackness had faded just enough for her to make out shapes. Not just shadows, but forms. Figures, standing still in the distance. Their eyes glowed faintly. She froze. Her heart stopped for a moment. They were watching her. Every single one of them. The cold, empty faces stared. But they didn't move. It was as if they were waiting for her to make the next move. A choice. Suddenly, the man's voice again. Closer this time. Do you see them? Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but her words wouldn't come. They're like you, he continued. Stuck in the game. No way out. Not without losing yourself. She pushed herself up. Her body shaking. Feeling the weight of his words. Behind her. She heard the door creak open. A sliver of light. Was it real? Or just another trick? Turn around, Sarah. His voice was soft now. Don't be afraid. She hesitated. The choice was unbearable. The light behind her seemed to pulse. Inviting her to step through. To escape. But something inside her, a gut feeling, told her to stay. Sarah looked back at the figures. They were still. Waiting. And then, as if on cue, one of them stepped forward. A woman. She was familiar. Her face pale, eyes hollow. Sarah, the woman said softly. Stay with us. Don't leave. Her voice was pleading. But Sarah couldn't move. She knew what this was. The woman was one of them. Trapped. Stay and be free, the man's voice echoed. Growing louder. More insistent. But Sarah felt a sharp tug inside her. A strength she didn't know she had. She took a deep breath. And she stepped forward. She didn't look back. The door slammed shut behind her. And the darkness closed in once again. The cold air hit her like a wall. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened with every breath. Each one coming slower than the last. Sarah stumbled forward. Her feet dragging. The world around her was a blur. A murky fog, thick and suffocating. The silence was deafening. But then, a sound. A faint whisper. A voice she didn't recognize. You're not alone. It came from all directions. Soft at first, like wind rustling through trees. But it grew louder. Closer. Sarah. She froze. Her heart pounded in her throat. Her eyes darted around. But there was nothing but the fog. No figures. No shadows. The voice continued. Almost a hum, a chant. You can't hide from this place. She spun again. The world was still. But the voice. It was inside her head. The whispering grew louder. Intensifying. Filling her mind. Climbing into her thoughts. Her hands flew to her ears. But it did nothing. The voice was everywhere. Every corner. Every crack in the air. Her body trembled with the pressure. She wanted to scream. But no sound came out. And then, a flash of light. Sudden and blinding. She squinted, shielding her eyes. The world around her was shifting. The fog evaporated, replaced by a harsh, white light. It felt like being pulled through a vortex. Everything spinning out of control. Her body was weightless. Her mind dizzy. And then, nothing. Complete silence. She opened her eyes slowly. It was like waking from a dream. Her surroundings were different. No longer the oppressive fog. No more shadows. She was standing in the middle of a room. A plain, featureless space. White walls, a cold concrete floor. The air was still. The only sound now was her breath. Sarah didn't move. She was frozen in place, staring at the blank space around her. She wasn't sure how long she stood there. Minutes? Hours? Then, the door opened. It was the man. He stepped inside. His figure dark against the blinding white light. "You made it," he said. His voice like an echo in the emptiness. "Did I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly. "Yes. But not in the way you think." She frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "You're free now, Sarah." His smile was cold, detached. "But not from me." Sarah took a step back. The door slammed shut behind him. "There's no escape from this place," he said softly. "You're part of it now." The room around her seemed to close in. The walls felt like they were pressing in, tightening around her. Her chest tightened again, as if the air had vanished. The man watched her, his face unreadable. "You can never leave." "Not really." Her body trembled. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes darted around. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the walls began to move. Shifting. Breathing. Like the room itself was alive. Her pulse raced. Was this real? The man stepped closer. His footsteps slow. Measured. "Sarah, there's no escape," he repeated. "You've always been part of this. You just didn't know it." She backed away. But there was nowhere to run. The walls closed in further. The air thickened. A door. A door appeared. Just as quickly as it had vanished. A way out. But before she could reach it, the man's voice stopped her. "Leave if you want," he said. "But you'll never escape me." Sarah hesitated. Then she stepped through. The door slammed shut behind her. And the light flickered. The light flickered. For a moment, everything was dark again. Then, a cold breeze brushed past her face. She gasped, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The air felt different this time. Heavy with a sickly sweetness. She blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The light returned. But it wasn't the same. It was dim. Flickering. Unstable. The walls around her were warped. The colors bled into each other. Shifting. She looked down at her feet. The floor wasn't concrete anymore. It was soft. Grass? She took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The ground beneath her felt wrong. A soft murmur rose from the ground. A voice. But this one wasn't the man. It was something worse. "Welcome home." Sarah froze. Her skin prickled. She knew that voice. The woman. She spun around. But no one was there. The trees around her swayed. Too quickly. Too violently. "Why did you come back?" The voice was close now. Too close. In her ear. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She turned again. Faster this time. But still, nothing. The silence was unbearable. The trees stretched out. Endless. They loomed overhead. casting long, twisted shadows. Leave. Now. It was the man's voice. Rougher this time. Sarah's breath caught. She knew it wasn't over. She had never left. The ground beneath her feet shifted again. It was like walking on something unstable. The earth trembled with each step. Her legs buckled. She dropped to the ground, her hands scraping against the grass. The air was thick with whispers, growing louder, filling her mind. The woman's voice broke through. Don't try to fight it. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, holding her breath. She couldn't take this anymore. She opened her eyes and saw them. The figures, standing in the distance. Just like before. The same cold, hollow faces. But this time, they weren't still. They were moving. Slowly. Unnervingly. You're not the first, the woman's voice said again. Her words slithered into Sarah's thoughts. And you won't be the last. The figures began to approach. One by one. The woman's face materialized before her. Pale, like a ghost. Her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's. Why are you here? Sarah managed to whisper. The woman smiled. A slow, chilling grin. To bring you home. Before Sarah could react, the woman's hands shot out, gripping her wrists. The touch was ice cold. The skin like dead flesh. The world around Sarah blurred. The figures closed in. Everything spun. And the darkness swallowed her whole. When it faded, there was nothing. Nothing but a black void. Sarah could feel her own breath. But she could see nothing. She wasn't sure if her eyes were open. Or if she was still dreaming. Then, she heard it again. The soft murmur of voices. Low, like a chant. Sarah. 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 Her name echoed through the void. She tried to scream. But no sound came. Her chest tightened. Her body went cold. And then, a bright light. The light that had swallowed her before. She was pulled into it. The voices faded. The cold faded. And in the end, the only thing that remained was the endless echo of her name. The light grew blinding, filling every inch of her vision. It was like being pulled through the center of the universe. A force she couldn't control. Her body felt weightless, suspended in nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light faded. She was standing again. On solid ground. But this time, everything was different. The air was thick. Stale, suffocating. A distant hum vibrated through the floor. The walls were no longer warped. They were perfectly smooth. Unnervingly sterile. And she was not alone. A figure stood in front of her. Tall, imposing. It was him. The man. But he didn't smile this time. His face was blank. Empty. Welcome back, he said, his voice cold and hollow. Sarah's chest tightened. The words didn't make sense. Hadn't she already been here? Wasn't this the same place? Back? She whispered, her voice hoarse. She didn't know if she was speaking to him or to herself. She didn't know what was real anymore. The man didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the room. Sarah looked around. Her gaze sweeping the sterile walls. There was nothing. No windows. No doors. Nothing but the smooth concrete floor and the hum of the air. Where am I? She asked, her voice breaking. His gaze met hers. His eyes cold as steel. Where you belong. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Belong? She felt a sudden pull. A pressure in her chest. The hum in the room grew louder. Her knees wobbled. But she steadied herself. She wasn't going to fall apart now. Who are you? she asked, her voice rising. The man tilted his head. A slow, deliberate motion. I told you, he said softly. Almost pityingly. You've always been here. Sarah's heart skipped. She couldn't process it. Hadn't she escaped? Hadn't she walked through the door? What do you want from me? She demanded. Her voice desperate. The man stepped closer. His footsteps echoed. Each one heavier than the last. I've told you. This is your home, Sarah. He reached out slowly. His fingers grazing her cheek. The coldness of his touch made her flinch. But she didn't pull away. There's no escape, he whispered. The words hung in the air, weighing her down. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. It felt as if something invisible was holding her in place, binding her to the spot. I don't belong here, she said, almost to herself. His lips twitched into the faintest smile. That's what they all say. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The hum grew louder, more intense. Sarah blinked, and the sterile walls around her began to blur. The edges of the room seemed to warp and twist, like a reflection in cracked glass. She gasped. Her mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. Was she still trapped? Had she been here all along? She tried to take a step, but the floor felt unstable. The man's eyes didn't leave her. You never left, Sarah. The air around her pulsed, like a heartbeat. Her chest tightened again, and she could barely breathe. No, she whispered. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But the man's expression didn't change. Real is what you make it. And just like that, the room shifted completely. The walls were gone. She was standing in the middle of a forest. The trees were dark, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, and the sky above was a deep, shadowed purple. A soft wind blew through the trees. A whisper. Welcome home, Sarah. And the darkness closed in. The wind whispered again, its voice like 1,000 secrets carried on the breeze. Welcome home, Sarah. The trees loomed, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, grasping at the sky. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward her, pressing her forward. Her heart raced. Her breath quickened. Her feet moved. But it was as though they moved on their own. She wanted to stop, to scream, to fight. But the forest around her seemed to pull her in. There was something familiar about this place. She didn't know why. She couldn't place it. But it felt like it had always been here. The trees shifted, their branches creaking, groaning. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah. The voice again. That same, cold whisper. She turned around. But the forest was empty. She was alone. But she wasn't alone. Her mind raced. Her heart pounded harder with each step she took. A flash of movement caught her eye. A figure. Far off in the distance. A silhouette. The man. She could feel his presence. It was like he was everywhere and nowhere. Why are you doing this to me? She screamed into the forest, her voice cracking with desperation. The trees didn't answer. The wind didn't respond. The silence that followed felt worse than anything she had ever experienced. She turned, and the figure was closer. The man. But his face. It was different now. It was pale. Frozen. Empty. He stepped forward, and the ground seemed to pulse beneath his feet. Sarah backed away, her legs trembling. Her whole body felt like it was on fire. Why? She whispered again. This time more broken. The man's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "You should have known, Sarah." "Known what?" she gasped. Her words were barely a whisper in the heavy air. He took another step toward her. The shadows seemed to follow him, swallowing the ground beneath his feet. "This is where it ends, Sarah. You never left. This place is your home." She shook her head furiously, desperately trying to deny it. "No, no, I escaped. I left." The man's expression softened. Just for a second. But it was worse that way. The pity in his eyes. "You never left, Sarah. You've always been here." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The trees shook, their branches groaning. The whispers in the wind grew louder, rushing toward her. She could barely breathe, her lungs constricting. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her legs wouldn't move. A sudden realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't running from the man. She was running from herself. She had always been here. Stuck. Trapped. The forest wasn't real. The man wasn't real. The fear wasn't real. It was all her. Her mind. Her own twisted creation. Her chest tightened painfully. And she dropped to her knees, tears filling her eyes. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears, filling her soul. But in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't just trapped in this place. She had created it. The light. The man. The forest. It had always been her. And no matter how far she ran, it would never let her go. "Sarah." The voice was softer now. Gentler. She closed her eyes. And the forest began to fade. The shadows fell away. The trees became distant shapes. And then, the world was still. Empty. No light. No sound. Just silence. And in that silence, she finally understood. There was no escape. Because she was the nightmare. The silence stretched, growing thicker, heavier. Sarah's mind raced. Her thoughts tangled in a knot of disbelief. She was the nightmare. The realization crashed into her like a tidal wave, washing away the last remnants of hope. Every breath she took felt like a struggle, as though her very existence was being pulled apart, piece by piece. But there was something else now. Something deeper. Like a pulse beneath the darkness. A soft thumping sound. Slow, steady. Not her heartbeat. Something else. It was familiar. Her eyes snapped open. But the void remained. It was endless. Infinite. Like staring into the abyss of her own soul. And then, a flicker. A flicker of light. Her breath hitched. For the first time in what felt like an eternity. There was something. A shape. A figure. It wasn't the man. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the forest. It was her. Her own reflection. Standing in the distance. She took a step toward it. Her legs trembling. Her chest tightening with every inch closer. The reflection didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, invisible barrier between them. And the reflection did the same. It was her. But it wasn't. The face staring back at her was hollow. Empty. A shell. Her eyes were dark. Almost black. And there was nothing behind them. Nothing. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection didn't speak. But its lips curled into a twisted smile. A smile she knew all too well. It was the same smile the man had. The same, it whispered back. Its voice echoing through her mind. Always the same. Sarah recoiled. Her heart pounding. It wasn't her reflection. It was her. A part of her. A part of this place. Stop, she pleaded, clutching her chest. I don't want to be this. I don't want to be trapped. I just want out. But the reflection only stared. And then, the ground beneath her shifted again. The void trembled, cracking like glass. She felt her knees, her hands gripping the cold floor. The walls, if they could even be called walls, began to crumble. The echoes of her own voice filled the space. But now it was just noise. An endless loop of her screams. Her pleas. Her regret. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to block it out. But it was everywhere. A sudden pressure on her chest made her gasp. The reflection was closer now. Its breath was cold against her face. It whispered again. You were never meant to leave. The words sliced through her like a knife. The ground cracked again. And for a fleeting second, the darkness split. The ground cracked again. And for a fleeting second, the darkness split. Through the crack, she saw something. A door. A doorway. The faintest sliver of light. Her heart skipped. This was it. She could make it. She could escape. But as she scrambled to her feet, the reflection's grip tightened around her wrist. No, it whispered. You can never leave. With one final, desperate cry, she tore herself free, racing toward the door. Her legs were burning, her mind screaming at her to stop. But she pushed forward, one step at a time, into the light. The door loomed closer. The reflection's voice followed her, growing louder. You can never leave, Sarah. You will always come back. With a final burst of strength, she stepped through the door. And everything went black. The light disappeared. The darkness swallowed her whole. And then, nothing. A void. No man. No reflection. No whispers. Just silence. In the end, there was no escape. Only the never-ending return to the beginning. The silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. Sarah opened her eyes. But there was no light. No shadow. Nothing. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet. She couldn't feel anything. Not the cold, not the warmth. Not even the air. She was empty. The nothingness stretched out before her. Unfathomable. Endless. Her thoughts were fragments. Scattered pieces that refused to align. Was she even breathing? She tried to move. But her body wouldn't respond. Her fingers twitched. Her arms. Her legs. Nothing. No sound. And then, as if from nowhere, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Sarah. It came from all directions. A whisper that raked through her mind. Her pulse quickened. Her heart was racing again. Though she couldn't feel it. It was him. The man. The voice was so close now. So close that it felt like he was in her head. His words curling around her thoughts. You think you've escaped, don't you? The question hung in the air. Without answer. Without meaning. She tried to speak. But her lips wouldn't move. You've always been here, Sarah. His words were calm now. Almost soothing. You've always been a part of this. And then she saw it. A flicker in the darkness. A shape. It was her. Her face. But different. Hollow. Empty. She reached for it. But it vanished. Her heart thudded. Was it gone? Had it ever been real? Sarah, the voice whispered again. But this time it was quieter. Gentler. She felt a tug. A sensation in her chest. A pull. Something was drawing her in. She opened her eyes wide. But there was still nothing. Just the sensation of falling. She tried to scream. But no sound came. Her body was paralyzed. It was as though she had no form. No substance. And then, in the distance, just on the edge of her mind, she saw it. A crack in the void. A fissure. It was small at first. Barely noticeable. But it grew. It widened. And through the crack, she saw a door. The same door she had seen before. The one that had slipped away just as she reached it. It was back. Her door. A chance to escape. Sarah tried to move toward it. But she was still trapped in the emptiness. She was helpless. Unable to reach the light. The man's voice came again. This time stronger. Closer. You think you can leave, but it's too late, Sarah. The door flickered. It flickered like a dying flame. No one leaves. The whisper turned into a shout. And the darkness around her twisted. The walls caved in. The light grew more distant. She pushed forward. But the pull grew stronger. She felt as if she was being torn apart. Her mind. Her soul. Splitting into pieces. And the door grew smaller. Her breath was ragged now. Her heart, it wasn't beating. It was a mere echo in the vast emptiness. The door was almost gone. But she couldn't stop herself from trying. With every ounce of strength. She reached. She reached for that final sliver of light. And then. Nothing. She was back. Back where it all started. The same empty space. The same silence. The same void. No door. No escape. And in that moment, she realized the truth. There never was an escape. Because she was the door. The realization hit Sarah like a thunderclap. Shocking her to her very core. She wasn't outside the door. She was the door. Her chest tightened. Her mind felt like it was shattering under the weight of it all. Every part of her screamed to escape. But now, there was nowhere left to run. The void seemed to pulse with energy. Breathing in and out. Like some ancient force that had been waiting. Her fingers twitched again. Her body still felt frozen. But now, the sensation was different. It was like a slow current running through her veins. She couldn't move. But she could feel the shift. The walls around her rippled. The darkness twisted. Shifting its shape like liquid. It was alive. She could feel its pull. Its weight on her shoulders. Heavy like lead. The whispering returned. Familiar. Closer. Sarah. The voice was soft, yet it echoed through the space. But this time, it wasn't just the man. It was her own voice. Coming from the depths of her mind. From the very place she had tried to escape. You can't outrun yourself. The words settled like stones in her stomach. She wanted to scream. To fight. To tear apart the very fabric of this place. But the truth gnawed at her. It wasn't a place. It was her. She was the creation and the creator. The whispering grew louder. More insistent. Until it filled every corner of her thoughts. You will always be here. Sarah staggered to her feet. Her legs shaking with an unfamiliar weight. She took a hesitant step. Then another. And the ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting. It wasn't solid. It wasn't real. And the more she moved, the more the void seemed to fold around her. Closing in like the jaws of some unseen beast. But then, the light returned. It flickered. Weak at first. Then stronger. The faintest sliver. Her breath hitched. The door, door, was there again. But this time, she didn't run toward it. She stood still. Frozen in place. Her reflection appeared in front of her again. But it wasn't the same. It was her, yes. But her face was cracked. Shattered like broken glass. The eyes staring back at her were full of anguish. Full of emptiness. Her reflection opened its mouth. And in a voice not her own. It whispered. "You can't escape your truth." And the ground trembled again. But this time, she didn't feel the pull. This time, she understood. The door flickered once more. But it didn't fade. It was her. And it would always be. Sarah's heart beat. Finally. A slow, steady thump. For the first time in what felt like eternity. She breathed. But it wasn't the escape that mattered anymore. It wasn't the door. It was the acceptance. She was the door. She was the darkness. And she was the light. Everything was one. And as the door cracked open before her, she stepped through. Not to escape. But to embrace. The world outside didn't matter. Because she had found herself. As Sarah stepped through the threshold, she didn't feel the jarring cold she had expected. Instead, it was warm. Strangely comforting. Her surroundings began to shift. Morphing into something new. Something alive. The world was changing. And she was at the center of it all. She blinked. And suddenly, the void was gone. The darkness dissolved like mist in the sun. Replaced by soft, glowing light. It wasn't bright. But warm. Like a sunset after a storm. She was standing on soft grass. The scent of fresh earth filling the air. In the distance, there were trees. But not twisted and dark like before. These trees were alive. Growing, stretching toward the sky. It was a place of stillness. A place of peace. The air was calm. Yet it felt as if everything was humming. Buzzing with potential. As if the world itself was waiting for her next move. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel lost. She felt whole. Her reflection, her fractured self, had been left behind. But now she understood. The shattered pieces were part of her. Integral to the whole. And as she took a tentative step forward, a ripple moved through the ground. Like a wave of energy passing beneath her feet. The trees around her bent toward the sound. Their leaves shimmering in the gentle breeze. It was as though the world was alive. Aware of her presence. "Welcome home." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. But it wasn't the man. It wasn't the woman. It was the world itself. Sarah's heart swelled. It was the voice of her own soul. Reaching out to her. Welcoming her back. Not as an outsider. But as its creator. Its equal. She didn't need to fight anymore. She didn't need to escape. She was home. Not in a place. But within herself. And the door? It wasn't gone. It was always there. She was the door. She was the keeper. She was the light and the shadow. The darkness and the dawn. With a deep, contented breath, Sarah stepped into the center of the world. Her hands raised toward the sky. And the universe opened up before her. Unfolding like a map. Endless and full of possibility. In that moment, Sarah realized the truth that had eluded her for so long. She had never been trapped. She had only been waiting. Waiting for the moment when she could become everything. The door was always open. It had always been open. And as Sarah stepped into the light, she became the universe. The air around Sarah shifted. A soft, almost imperceptible hum that resonated deep within her chest. Her body tingled as if the very fabric of the universe was aligning to her presence. The ground beneath her feet felt strangely solid. But also, alive. She looked around, taking in the place that surrounded her. A vast, endless expanse of shifting colors. It was as though the world was in a constant state of flux. Ever changing. Ever evolving. And yet, everything felt familiar. She closed her eyes for a moment. Listening. She could hear the whispers again. But this time, they weren't terrifying. They were soft, soothing. Like the rustle of wind through leaves. Sarah. Her name. The voice was unmistakable. But this time, it wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was welcoming. She opened her eyes. And there, standing in front of her, was the man. But he wasn't the same. Gone was the coldness. Gone was the darkness. His eyes were warm. Almost kind. "You've done it," he said softly. "You've finally come to understand." Sarah swallowed. Her throat dry. I don't understand." He smiled. A gentle, knowing smile. "You always have. It's just been hidden from you." She shook her head. Her mind a whirlwind. How could this be? How could she be the one who created this place? The man stepped closer. And with each step, the world around her seemed to calm. As if the universe was listening to him. To them. "This isn't a prison, Sarah. It's a creation. A reflection of your own soul." Her heart pounded in her chest. And for the first time, she felt the weight of what he was saying. The truth. "You are the door," he continued. His voice like a bomb to her tortured mind. "You always were. And now you are free." Free. The word echoed in her mind, repeating itself like a mantra. She looked down at her hands. And for the first time, she saw them as they truly were. Strong, capable, whole. The chains she had once felt. The ones that bound her to this place. Vanished. Sarah raised her head, meeting the man's gaze. A sense of peace washed over her. And she realized, in that moment, that she was no longer afraid. The whispers faded into the background. The voices now quiet. As if they were no longer necessary. And with one final, deep breath, she stepped forward. Not toward him. Not toward the door. But toward herself. The universe stretched out before her. Its endless possibilities now hers to shape. No longer trapped. No longer running. Sarah had become the creator. The keeper of her own fate. And with that, the world bloomed. New and infinite. Just like her. The world around Sarah seemed to stand still. Everything was quiet. Almost too quiet. The vast expanse of light and shadow before her felt both infinite and intimate. As if she had become one with everything she could see, and everything she couldn't. Her heart no longer raced. There was no more fear. No more confusion. There was no more fear. No more confusion. There was only the deep, comforting pulse of existence. Something ancient. Something timeless. She took a step forward. And with each movement, the world shifted around her, shaping itself to the rhythm of her thoughts. The trees bent toward her, their branches dancing like slow-moving shadows. The air around her shimmered, alive with energy, alive with her own presence. It was no longer a void, no longer an empty space. It was her space. Sarah felt the weight of everything she had been, and everything she had feared, fall away. There were no more voices. No more whispers of uncertainty. There was only clarity. Only understanding. She was no longer the prisoner of her past. No longer a victim of her own creation. She had been the door all along. And now, she was the keeper. The man, the figure that had haunted her. was gone. But in his place stood something else. A presence. A feeling of deep peace. Like an ancient spirit watching over her. Her eyes wandered across the landscape she had shaped. And for the first time, she saw the beauty in the cracks. The imperfection in the perfect. Everything was a reflection of her journey. And now, as she stood there, she knew. This was her beginning. Not her end. The door was always open. It was always her. She smiled softly. A sense of calm washing over her. There was no longer any need to run. No need to hide. No need to escape. She was free. And for the first time, she could hear the quiet whisper of the wind. Not as a warning, but as a welcome. Welcome home, Sarah. And with that, she took one final step. Not into the unknown, but into herself. The world around her faded into light, blurring into an endless horizon of possibilities. And Sarah? She had become everything.